So today for our Sunday Moravian text reading, we are in Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 7 to 14. This is a prophecy of restoration, a prophecy of returning. Now just to put the passage into context, Jeremiah lived at a time when his nation, the nation of Israel, had been captured and the people had been taken away into slavery, into Babylon. This was a time and a place where the people had lost their freedom. And Jeremiah is speaking, prophesying hope over God's people. He's speaking of a day where God would restore them and bring them back home and bring them back to what they knew and what they loved, their normal lives. And I do believe that this is a prophetic word for us for today, for God's people at a time of lockdown and restrictions. God will restore. God will gather those scattered. We don't put our hope in Bojo or scientists. We put our hope in God. We know that He will do it. And I've said many times before that when reading scripture, I love highlighting the God verbs in a passage, the doing words of God. It's worth doing that in this passage. God gathers. God leads into freedom, young and old, from the north and the south. God brings them back, this procession from captivity. Among them, it says, will be the lame and the blind and the heavily pregnant. God's work of restoring, of returning, it leaves no one out. And you might think, well, I could never go back. I don't have the strength to journey back. But this is God's work, and He will equip and strengthen you for the journey back home. I know people say things like, well, we'll never go back to how things were. There's no returning to normal. It will have to be a new normal. Well, yes and no. It depends on what you mean by normal, doesn't it? It depends on your definition of normal. Here, God is saying to His people, He's going to restore them to a former place of freedom, restored relationship, freedom from fear. That should be the normal. And when the Israelites returned from captivity, things actually looked very different for them. Jerusalem had been burned to the ground. It had been leveled to the ground. You can read about that in Nehemiah. And so in that new normal, there had to be a time to rebuild. And I think that's a Kairos word, a theme for 2021, a time to rebuild. So I'd really encourage you to be reading Nehemiah through January as we think about that as a church. But just as we finish, let's just focus on the last two verses, 13 and 14. It says that when God restores His people, when He does that, God will turn our mourning into dancing. God will turn our sorrow into comfort and joy. God will satisfy you and I, His priestly people, it says, with abundance. God specializes in restoring and returning His people. So as we wait for that, how ought we to live? How do we live in the gap between the promise and the fulfillment? How do we wait? Well, go back to verse 7, the start of this prophecy. God says, because you know what I'm going to do, I want you to sing for joy. I want you to shout aloud. I want you to make some noise, the sort of confident faith in God that is verbalized to the world around us. And that's what this passage is all about.